Hello, BookTube. Recently, CriminOlly made a video, and I know you're all groaning now. Hear me out. He made one of his Sunday Bollocks videos where he picks a bookish subject to talk about. And it was great. They always are. I'll leave a link to his video down below. And this one was on Mammoths. Great big books, huge books. And basically whether or not they cost out as being worth it. Are books too long? Are too many books too long? And as his conversation went on, it grew into a discussion of what we all get out of really long books. And are they any different? Is what we get any different out of a really long book from what we get out of a much shorter book? And Shelly Swearingen did a response video. I'll leave a link to hers as well. And naturally, if Mammoth books, things over 800 pages, are going to come up, I'm going to do a response video of my own because I dearly, dearly love them. I try not to let that love sway me. I realize that there's a subjective element there and that my sheer affection for them might cause me to overrate them. Also, it's been known historically that readers tend to overrate really long books just because of the sheer flag-planting effort involved in getting from one end to the other. I maintain that that is a very large part of the reason why An Infinite Jest is rated so highly by brainless dude bros all over the world. It's partly because they haven't read anything, but it's also because they feel a sense of accomplishment in having finished this thing that's so incredibly, dramatically, hysterically, needlessly long. I don't feel quite that sense of flag-planting accomplishment. The reason why I feel emotionally bonded to longer books is because, and now again, hear me out here, because this is going to sound poncy, and I don't mean it that way. One of the big reasons, emotional reasons, why I love Mammoth books is because it's the only situation in which the reading experience that I have is roughly the same as the reading experience that almost everybody else I know has. For those of you who are new to my channel, I read very fast. I don't technically do anything like speed reading, Evelyn Wood, or any courses like that. I don't do anything that's a gimmick. It's just my reading muscles are in very good shape. I do nothing else. I take care of my little baby Bean, my little dog, and other than that, I read and write, and that's all I do. As a result, my reading muscles are in extremely good shape. I read very fast, and I also read for a large amount of every day. Sometimes half the hours out of 24 or more given over to reading. That's a vast amount of reading. And when midnight rolls around and I turn into a pumpkin, I turn off all means of the outside world contacting me other than knocking on my door, and even then I ignore it. I vanish from the world at midnight, and I stay vanished until I reconnect with the internet in the morning. Sometimes those hours, those nighttime hours when you're all drooling on your pillows, sometimes those nighttime hours include sleeping on my part. I hate it. It's always very involuntary, but it sometimes does happen. But very often, the whole of those hours between midnight and when the sun comes up is reading time. At well over 100 pages an hour, that can burn through a book in no time at all. Those of you who have watched this channel for years have seen that when I'm talking about the stuff that's going on the TBR for this night, there'll be a little stack of books. I've had newcomers to this channel over the years actually email me and say, well, you meant that's your TBR for many nights, right? Not just one night. And I have to tell them, no, I mean just one night of dedicated, fast reading. Doesn't make me superior to you in any way. The thing that makes me superior to you is my physical appearance. The wavy raven hair, the smoldering come-hither eyes, the chiseled cheekbones, the A-frame shoulders, the 8-pack abs. Need I say more? but when it comes to reading, that creates a very different reading atmosphere for me than it does for, well, right now, all of the other readers that I know in my life, either on BookTube or in real life. All the other readers that I know open a book and get to work on it. And it's the work of a day or 3 days or a week. And again, there is no shade at all here. There is nothing whatsoever, because all those people have a huge amount else going on in their life. They have a job that requires pants. They have loved ones that require attention from time to time. They may even be so ill-advised as to have children. Those things are what the kids refer to as a time suck. Also, when we're talking about time sucks, a great number of those people, again, I'm not going to harp. I'm not trying to sound the way these words on paper alone would sound. A great number of the people that I'm referring to, in addition to all of those other obligations, also never exercise any self-control. Never any self-control. Which means that if they feel like reading and they know how good that's going to make them feel, and they start to play, the beginning of a 10-hour video game, they don't control themselves. They'll just start. They know what's going to happen. They know they're not going to be able to make themselves stop, but they'll do it anyway. And come 1 in the morning, they'll crawl into bed all scratchy-eyed and hate themselves for not having read. Or they'll take out their phone and they'll want to open the Kindle app on their phone or the Kobo app on their phone and do some reading, and instead they'll doom scroll. And they'll start doom scrolling even though they know they won't be able to stop, because they are not exercising any self-control, because the 21st century has completely eroded the whole idea of self-control from most people. You take those things together, all of those obligations, those real-world obligations, plus the total unwillingness to control yourself, and you're not going to get as much reading done as someone who, A, doesn't have any of those distractions, or almost none. My time is coming. I know my time is coming in only, well, it'll feel like 10 minutes, but it's probably 7 years, 8 years. In 7 or 8 years, the little dog that I referred to, who's right next to me now, will require more time. She'll require care in addition to friendship. And who knows if there might not be other dogs between now and then. And there could even be, who knows, other obligations, jobs that I have to go to, meetings. Every once in a while I have to go to an in-person meeting even now. But for right now, there's nothing at all. Right now, I have none of those obligations, and I also am from a previous century. It sometimes feels like several centuries ago, and have no problem exercising self-control. And as a result, I burn through books. I fly through them. I lightning flash through them. And so, the only time that our reading experiences intersect is when I have a huge book. When I have a 1,000-page book, a 1,500-page book, I'm not going to be able to do it in one lightning flash, and I'm not going to want to either. Something like that. And except in very rare instances, I'm not going to want to burn through it in a solid 10 hours of reading. So instead, in those isolated instances, I will be reading the same way as everybody else I know. I will have a bookmark that is slowly moving. I will be ruminating over a chunk of a book that I've read, but not over the whole book. That almost never happens. Most of the time, most books, especially those of you who are new to the channel might not know, that I concentrate a large amount of my reading on American new releases in 16 or 17 different genres. The ones that I generally like, the ones that I generally like to read. And most of those books, most publishers, they will get a manuscript and they will say, no, it takes exactly this long to go through the printing press. The cost for the ream of paper is exactly this much per pound. This book is going to be 238 pages. If the manuscript that you and your agent and your editor have pushed through with us is longer than that, cut it. It's got to be 238 pages. That is exactly the right place to make sure that the physical production costs of the book aren't onerous. That's exactly where this thing is going to stop, unless someone makes a screaming from the rooftops Mae West style case for a book to be much longer. But some pro forma study of, what's wrong with politics today? First of all, most of those cases, the manuscript of the book, you'd be lucky if you could put it on the rack and stretch it to 238 pages. But if, for instance, you've written one of those books or some Christian memoir or something or other, and you've just, again, lost all self-control and turned in a 570-page manuscript, your publisher will deal with that, and it won't be the way you like. So in most cases like that, if you get, like, for instance, what was the book that just came up? That new study that we saw on this channel that's been getting some press. That new study of the strongman in world politics. We got it on this channel, and my first impression of it was that it was a little pro forma. I read it; it was a little pro forma. There wasn't much deeper thinking than just reciting the stories of 10 strongmen. That book, 238 pages, something like that. I get that. Let's say we both got that at the same time. So we opened the mail at the same time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Let's say that it's out already, or that its release date is the following Monday. I'm going to do exactly what I did. I'm going to take that finished copy, put it on my TBR for that night, and read it that night. And it's going to be 2 hours at the absolute most, pen in hand. 2 hours at the absolute most before that book is done and gone. Done and gone, as thoroughly digested as I would argue it is going to get digested by anybody, by any critic, certainly. I think really hard about what I read, and I don't forget most of it. So around 2 hours, probably less than that. Now think about your own situation in that regard. You unpack it at 3 in the afternoon, you think, oh, I'd like to read this right away. I had other things on my TBR, but I'd like to get to this right away. But what's right away for you? You've got to chop all sorts of vegetables and saute meat for a supper that has to pass muster from your spouse and feed 2 of your offspring who aren't old enough to work a stove on their own. Then when that's done, well, you've got to spend time with those little parasites of yours, don't you? You can't just ignore them and go into your man cave. You might even not be allowed to have a man cave or a woman cave. That's going to take time too. And then, I don't know, does the family have some sort of communal activity that they've convinced themselves is fun? Maybe they watch Coronation Street or EastEnders or something like that. And then the children have to be put to bed, and they're not going to want to be put to bed, and maybe they've had too much amphetamines or whatever. I don't know what kids have these days. Eventually, you wrestle and negotiate them into bed, at which point you come back downstairs. Your spouse is asleep in front of the TV. You're dead on your feet. You pour yourself a slug of whiskey and say, all right, well, now it's time to sit down with this book. And it's, let's say, 9:30. Let's give you superhuman endurance and say you open the book, The Strong Man, and you read for an hour. A solid, uninterrupted hour. So from 9:30 to 10:30. Now, you and I both know that's unlikely to happen, but let's say you did. Okay, well, it's a 238-page novel. Most people read between 20 and 30 pages an hour. So if you've given it an hour, you've gotten through the first chapter and some change. You've gotten through the introduction, and you are embarked on the first of the book's profiles. And you feel absolutely dead. You feel so tired, you're not even sure you can undress and go to bed. You think you're actually tempted for a moment to just go to sleep in the chair. You put the book down, you haul yourself through your nightly ablutions, you go to bed, and that's it for that day. Now, at that point, I haven't even started reading yet. I'm not going to start reading until midnight, and at 2, I'll be done with the book. So, although I will be first in line to ask you what you thought of that first chapter, and I'll be first in line to ask you what you thought of the whole book when you're done with it, it's not the same experience. It's just not. It doesn't make mine any better. It's just a different world. It's just a completely different world. And that changes completely when we're talking about a huge book. Not completely, but it changes as much as it's ever going to change. It brings our reading experiences as close together as they're ever going to come. Because if I start a 1,000-page book at midnight, not only am I not going to want to read that whole thing until dawn, I'm going to want to break things up. Unless I'm totally caught up in a book, I'm not going to want to stick with it for hour after hour after hour. I'm going to want a little variety. But also, even if I did want to stick with it, it probably won't be enough time. Probably at some point during those nighttime hours, I myself will have to sleep. In other words, with a really long book, the next day, Saturday, neither one of us will be done with it. We'll both be working on it. And that feels wonderful for me. I know that sounds strange, but that creates a brief moment of camaraderie with all the other readers that I know, for me. And only huge books do that, which tends to make me smile a little at them, although they are often dreadful. So they end up giving me no reason to smile. But at least at the beginning, they do feel that way. It feels like we're on the same ground. That's wonderful. So that's my relationship with Mammoths, is that they warm the cockles of my heart. uh, but Ollie addressed in his video, he wanted to know, first, start off with a physical challenge, which is pause his video, get up, assemble the last 10 print books that you read, and then come back and start his video again. Now, in his video, he says he doubts that anyone actually did that, and I'm not going to do that because, as has already been foreshadowed, I'm not wearing any pants. And some adults watch this channel. I don't want to traumatize anybody. So I picked ahead of time the last 10 books, print books that I read. We'll just go through those because Ollie has a point in mind, which is show us the books and then ask yourself, how many can you hold in one hand? So here are my 10. First was this thing by Peter Elstob, Hitler's Last Offensive, a UK Corgi mass market paperback from 60 years ago about the Battle of the Bulge. Then there's this thing, Janet McGregor's book, Rules for Engaging the Earl, a new Regency romance. I think this is already out. Yeah, this is already out. This came out in late April. I just didn't get to it. It's one of those square mass market paperbacks. See, so if we line up the spines here, see how far out that goes. It's a Kindle-shaped paperback. Then there was this thing from a Brattle Hall. This is a Skinner's novel by Marcus Pellegrimus, Teeth of Beasts, which had a couple of good action set pieces, but a lot of weaknesses. It had a lot of weaknesses. Well, I did not enjoy it as much as I was hoping. The Janet McGregor was pure sparkling bubbly, pure champagne, not a foot wrong. These ladies are professionals. They have first readers, friend readers, enemy readers, beta readers, a good support network at their publisher. I think this was St. Martin's. Was this St. Martin's? Yeah, St. Martin's. So that when you get this thing, there's not going to be a step wrong. There's not going to be egregious movie-style posturing or anything like that. And this was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Made me want to read, made me want to find a nice, durable hardcover or an ebook of this thing. So that was 3. Then In the Shadow of Lightning by Brian McClellan. Big fat fantasy novel, the first in a new trilogy. Pretty energetic, also never met a cliche I didn't like, which got a little bit annoying. I noticed it. You know, first 30 pages, first 50 times that it happened, I was willing to just sort of write it off as the author being excited, but excitement shades into laziness pretty quick. After a while, the pencil that I had was just circling the cliches, circling the lazy idioms. Pretty good ideas involved, and Adrian, the main character, one of the main characters, is a fantastic creation. Definitely want to read the next book, despite how boring. I hope the cover doesn't look like this. But that was the next one. Then we have this thing. This is by Aaron Sachs, no relation. This is Up from the Depths, study of Lewis Mumford, Herman Melville, and the psychosocial times. A very meaty book, perhaps over my head. Perhaps I was out of my depth. But I absolutely love, of course, I love the parts on Melville. But the Lewis Mumford parts, Lewis Mumford is not an author who's read today. And this reminded me that every time I've ever read anything by him, I've liked it. So, but anyway, we weren't supposed to be reviews of the books. We were just supposed to show you. Then the next one, Behemoth. This is volume 2 of the new Princeton collected works of W.H. Auden, volume 2 of the poetry. Big, huge thing. And I don't know exactly that this counts as reading, since I wasn't reading the poems. I was reading all of the notes, the introduction, all of the end papers, all of that. This might not count as that, and that would certainly account for why it's in such pristine shape, because it wasn't actually grappling with it nonstop. This next one is one of these Avenel omnibus editions that I just love. I think there's something about them. Maybe it's also nostalgia. I used to sell them. We saw this on this channel. I hauled it from the Brattle. This is an Avenel omnibus volume of Dashiell Hammett novels, and I absolutely I absolutely could not pass this edition up for a rather obvious reason. I had to get this one. This is it. And I didn't read this whole thing. Instead, I read just The Thin Man, the final book here. and really, really enjoyed the rereading experience. I read The Thin Man. Last time I read it was a cheap paperback 40 or 50 years ago, something like that. And reading it again was a total new experience. One of the reasons why I love rereading is because you change drastically. I'm still super hot, but I have changed drastically since the last time I read that book. You're going to notice a whole bunch of different things, a whole bunch of things that never even crossed your mind to notice the first time. Property values, how rich are Nick and Nora Charles, for instance? What kind of money do they have? And also, one thing that was utterly unavoidable to notice when I was reading The Thin Man again this time is that every single character, except maybe the dog, every single character in the book, good, bad, and morally indifferent, is stewed to the gills all the time. All the time. The characters are talking about alcohol all the time. Even at breakfast scenes, in action scenes, in the aftermath of action scenes, in the aftermath of tragedy. The book is, so to speak, saturated with it. I definitely did not notice that the first time. No, obviously, I'm not any kind of a holy rolling teetotaler. I am perfectly happy to get 3 sheets to the wind and be delighted about it when I have guests over here. But I definitely didn't notice that the first time. I only read that book, the Thin Man, but I don't have any individual Dashiell Hammett. I just have this anthology. Then there was this thing, which we saw on this channel, a kind of big fat fantasy novel about superpowered teenagers, Ordinary Monsters, by J.M. Muro, which had a lot of similarities to the McClellan. It's first of all, does not need to be this long, and also is rather noticeably populated with heavy-handed, lazy writing. I mean, there's really good writing in it too, and a great deal of conceptual energy. It was a world that I liked entering. It was a world that I liked being in. But I said I wasn't going to make these reviews. The point was just to show you. I can't help it. A leopard can't change his spots. The next one is this thing, Karl Marcy's book Rewired, about what the internet is doing to our brains, to our attention spans, to our sense of moral culpability, and also, sketchily anyway, what can be done about it. Is there anything that can be done about it? And then finally, this thing, Sacred Oath by Mark Esper, which was revolting, absolutely revolting. This was a public servant. This was not an employee of Donald Trump. Mark Esper was not an employee of Donald Trump. He was an employee of you and me. He was an employee of the United States government who saw a gibbering, dangerous madman in the Oval Office and did nothing about it at all. Totally betrayed his sacred oath. He saw a gibbering, dangerous madman in the Oval Office, and he said nothing, did nothing, instigated nothing except a few tiny tissue-thinged safeguards with a couple of other relatively normal people in Trump's orbit. The exact opposite of what a responsible, oath-upholding public servant should have done. And to have it dressed out in this kind of flag-waving sanctimony, it was an infuriating volume. Absolutely infuriating. I knew it would be. I didn't know exactly how it would be, but I knew it would be. But anyway, those are the 10 books. And if we ask, Ollie's challenge, see how many you can hold in one hand. I can hold those 3 in one hand. This, of course, the Auden is a challenge. You put the Auden and Up from the Depths. Can we do Brian McClellan? Yeah, there's one hand. There. The 3 mass market paperbacks and the Dash Hammett. Will that fit in one hand? Yeah, there we go. I have pretty big hands. I don't have quite the kind of hand that Shelly Swearingen describes in her video, but I still have pretty big, flexible hands. And one of all these questions after you had done that little exercise was, basically, is it worth it? Is the larger book worth it? Not only in terms of its own intrinsic merit, but in comparison to the smaller books. Now, of the books that I have described here, not a lot are actually what we'd call thin. The Dashiell Hammett novel alone probably is. And what else? Rewired. Yeah? Rewired is probably thin. I think that Up from the Depths probably is also thin, but it sure didn't feel it. This is a very textured book. So it was a slow and careful read. But for instance, this Elstop book is fairly big. And you can't really tell from a mass market paperback, but this is, 500 pages long. If I had a nice big trade paperback of this, or a hardcover, it would be a substantial book. And of course, the Auden is huge, just gigantic. This is what, 1,000 pages? 1,100 pages long. And the fantasy novel, we've got two fantasy novels here. They tend to want to be long anyway. This is almost 600 pages, and Ordinary Monsters is over that, I think. Yeah, 650 pages. So a lot of these things are big. I mean, the Regency romance is light in every sense of the word, and the Thin Man, yes, too. And that brings us to a little bit of a difficulty with I think I know the spirit in which all these questions are being asked, and they're good questions, very good questions. I hope that a lot of you look at the big fat books on your shelves and ask yourself some of these questions. Where do you stand when it comes to massive books? But I look at something like, all right, let's look at our examples here. This Wretched Thing did not need to be this long. A chunk of it is stuff that Mark Esper knows nobody cares about. Nobody cares what he did at various military postings or in his high school or college years when he was an honorable man. He is no longer an honorable man. He has to know that, or he wouldn't have hurried to write a book to buff up his reputation. The only thing that anybody cares about is the end part where he sold his honor. That's all anybody cares about. That's all anybody's quoting from. That is the sole meat and potatoes of him doing the rounds on the talk shows. So this is way, way too long. Nobody cares about Mark Esper's autobiography. They care about his time serving an insane dictator. That's all they care about, an insane wannabe dictator. But something like this, Edward Mendelssohn's introduction is not very long. It's just a few pages. But this is a huge amount of work. This is Auden's poems from 1940 to 1973, plus lots and lots of unpublished stuff. All of it carefully annotated. I don't know that there is a way that you could do this as well in fewer pages. I think this actually does have to be this long. It's certainly not anyone getting windy, unless the person getting windy is Auden. But if you're going to do a complete poetry, you're sort of stuck with what you're going to do. Which brings me to my own answer to one of Ollie's undergirding questions. Is it worth it? Are books too long? Here I want to make a point. I have 2 points that I want to wrap up with. One, the first one is, Ollie mentions in his video that the reading experience of reading a huge book is different from reading a shorter book. He toys with the idea immersive in his video and then rejects it because he rightly acknowledges that some very short books can be intensely immersive. Think of McClaverty's book Cal, for instance. His novel Cal is 100 pages, soaking wet. You'll be immersed in that world. You absolutely will be. Same thing with John Gardner's book Grendel. Very popular in schools in America because it's so short. Totally immersive. As immersive as any of the very much longer books that Gardner wrote. So immersive is the wrong word, but I think I know what Ollie was talking about. I myself wouldn't use the term immersive so much as I would the term surround sound and enwrapping. A big book takes you into its world in a different sense than immersing you. It's not the sense of immersion in that you really feel like this world is real. It's the sense of enwrapping you in which you feel like you are inside the book until you finish it. It's hard to put into words. There is no good English term for what really big books do when you're reading them, whether they be fiction or nonfiction. I'd like to stick up for nonfiction here since nobody ever does when these questions come up, but the nonfiction books that get this long too. And there's a sense there that I have often referred to it as that very big books have their own gravity field. They have their own oxygen. So you're not immersed in an artificial environment, a shuttlecraft or a spacesuit. Instead, you become an inhabitant of that world. You are terraformed by that gravity, by that planet. And you become a part of that world until you work your way out of it. And smaller books can't do that because an element of that enwrapping is time. The sheer passage of time is an element of that experience. And you won't get, like, for instance, one of Ollie's favorite authors is Ed McBain, his police procedural novels. And they are worlds. They are a whole world. If you enter into one of those books, you're going to feel like you're walking the floors, the scuffed floors of the precinct house. You're going to feel like you know these characters coming and going on different jobs of their own. You're going to feel like you're part of that world. But you're going to be out of that world in an hour. No way about it. No way to stop that. Same thing with a Western, a cheesy science fiction novel. You're going to be out of that world in no time at all. And there is a particular feeling. Now, like I mentioned, those books are immersive, but they don't hold you. You're gone in an hour and a half. And that's different from the feeling of knowing that you aren't going to be out in an hour and a half, of being wrapped in the book. And no matter how disturbing the book might be, if a huge novel is done well, that specific feeling of being wrapped in that world, apart from immersion and apart from interest in the plot or the characters, that particular feeling of being wrapped in that world is very nice and can be very addictive. That is the explanation for why so many epic fantasy series or epic historical novel series are so huge. It's not that the author can't tell the story in fewer pages. Good Lord. Good Lord, it's not. Read one of Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight archive novels. And even if you have no training as an editor, you're going to see in a minute that that thing could be 200 pages. It's not that. It's not that the author needs that much space. It's that the author is intentionally trying to please readers with that feeling, that wrapped up feeling. And readers go for it. Absolutely go for it. Many's the time when I was selling books retail, when young men would come in and say, I really liked such and such a book, and I really liked such and such a book, and I'd say, well, those are we have them, but it sounds like one of the elements you want is that the thing be enormously long. And they would often sheepishly agree, even though they couldn't put their finger on why they wanted that to be true. They were smart enough to know that a book doesn't get better the longer it is, but they still wanted that. Totally understandable. I think that explains a lot of epic fantasy fandom. And that is something that a really long book can do that a shorter book can't do no matter how good it is. So when Ollie asks the question, would you rather finish these 4 books or finish this great big book? Well, it's a good question, because there is something that a really huge book can do that those shorter books can't do no matter how good they are. Just because of a matter of time. Just because of a matter of sunk cost. But I want to make a point. The first point that I want to make about this on this subject, after all this time I'm going to make a point, is the basic performance of any book, no matter how short or long it is the same. Should be the same. If you pick up a 1,000-page book and you love that feeling of being wrapped in the book, okay, that's fine. That's totally legitimate. You can read for any reason you like, and any reason that you like a book is a good reason, but because it's your reason and I want to hear all about it. But you shouldn't be willing to trade skill of execution for that feeling. You shouldn't be willing to wade through third-grade crap just to have that feeling of being wrapped in a book that you know you're not going to finish in 5 sittings. You shouldn't be willing to do that. All of writing, let's say all of fiction, since it's all that BookTube wants to talk about, all of fiction is the game, that old children's game of keeping a ball up in the air, right? Where the object of the game is to make sure the ball never falls to the ground. You're keeping the ball up in the air. That's what fiction is. That's the skill of fiction, is that the ball never falls down. You never need to go scrabbling for it. The author is keeping the ball in the air the whole time. And an author should be judged on their skill at doing that, regardless of how long the book is. You shouldn't be allowing any book that's 1,000 pages long, hundreds of pages of dead pages. That should never be possible. I was railing against the later books in Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time for exactly that reason. And there have been many other series where I've railed against that. That is not a legitimate trade-off. Whether the author is writing a pointed novella, something short and powerful, or a really long book, the ball should never come down. That's one point that I want to make, is that regardless of whether or not you love that wrapped up feeling, you should be holding longer books to the same account as anything else, because you shouldn't be wasting your time on stuff you know is bad that gives you the warm fuzzies. Which kind of circles back to the whole subject of self-control. I don't want to get all preachy on the subject, but it kind of does. But anyway, you shouldn't do that. The author, we pay our authors, we venerate them. The thing that separates them from us is that they have the skill to do that, to keep the ball up in the air. If the author is not displaying that skill and is just piling on pages, drop them. Trust me, there are other 1,000-page books out there that won't do that, that won't drop the ball. That's point number one that I wanted to make. Point number two is a little bit snottier and a little bit more off topic. Getting back to Ollie's original call to action in his video, where he says, stop this video, get up, collect the last 10 print books, physical books that you read, and show them to us, and then see how many you can hold in one hand. I want to point out that that request, although fun, and although a great spur to conversation, makes about as much sense as if someone said to you, all right, get up, go to the table, take a piece of paper, and write down the last 10 major operations you had without anesthesia. And then when we're done with that list, you'd be stopping there right away. You'd be saying, what on earth are you talking about? I'm not going to make a list like that. I've never had an operation without anesthesia. Are you crazy? You'd stop them right away if they did that. And that is what Ollie was asking. Because the last 10 books that I read are this. Notice I'm holding it in my hand. That's The Proving Trail by Louis L'Amour. But the 9 ones before that were on here as well. There you go. It's in my hand. It's pretty easy to do. And it totally removes the heft, the dusting, the bowed shelves, the lugging, the sloping, the falling to the floor with a great thud, the fingers going numb, the breastbone getting all weary. Totally removes all of that. This is the last 10 books that I read. It'll be the next 10 books that I read. Its weight never changes. And it sort of invalidates part of this whole question, except for the fetishism of great big books like this, just sitting there on the shelf. I know it's off topic, so I won't stress it. I just wanted to mention that this is the last 10 books, and that is not a big stack. That is easy to hold in one hand. It's also the last 100 books, or the last 1,000 books. Just to point that out, that's all. That it's entirely possible that talking about 1,000-page books printed on dead trees and held together poorly with bad glue that's going to deteriorate over time while the pages get yellow or brittle or rip or stain might not be the way BookTube is having this conversation in 10 years. Maybe not. Thought I'd mention it anyway. But anyway, I want to, this went long, of course, as discussion videos. As Ollie points out, discussion videos tend to get long, especially when we're talking about something fundamental like this. I have been having these conversations about huge books forever, and I love them. I especially love hearing your answers. Tell me where you stand on the question of enormous books. Do they depress you? When it comes time to pick a new book off the shelves, a printed book, do you avoid something like this? No matter how tempting the subject is, do you avoid it because of how big it is? Do you think, oh, well, I'm going to get 200 pages in and want something else. I'm going to put it down and that bookmark's never going to move. Do you think that way, or do they call to you? And do you get the difference that I'm talking about? Some people do have explicitly said this to me, the difference between being immersed in a book and being wrapped in a book's world. Do you think that's a legitimate difference? I could swear that it is. Shorter books can definitely immerse you, but they don't have that terraforming aspect. And some people really like that. Do you? Where do you stand on Ollie's latest question about huge books, about mammoths? Where do you stand on the subject? I would love to hear. Feel free to bombard the comment section. Feel free to email me. But also, if you're a booktuber, feel free to make a video. Because Shelly did. You can too. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. Good God, this went long. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.